Looking for top-tier talent and more profits for your business? Get real in the greater Rochester, New York region. With a highly skilled workforce and commercial real estate rates 49% lower than the national average, companies with 50 or more employees can make profits of $1 million a year more in Rochester than in other high-tech hubs like Boston, New York, DC, or San Francisco. Contact Greater Rochester Enterprise and get started today at rochesterbiz.com.
The one consistent in life is death.
This is the Murder Monday podcast.
Welcome to the podcast, and this is a kind of a strange one because I want to share some of the weirdest, scariest, strangest stories during the month of October that we've talked about during the Murder Monday podcast. And we're kicking off with probably one of the weirdest and scariest ones ever, because I think we've all had that moment in your house where you hear a noise, where you think you hear a noise. I remember my wife and I, we were living in an apartment once, and we heard a noise, we swear, outside of my apartment door, and no one else was in the apartment. So my way of dealing with the horror was to, of course, yell out, "Who's there?" And when she said, "Go check," I picked up a coffee mug, and as I walked around each corner, I swung it, thinking that that's what would take out an assailant that was there to murder me. Now, of course, nothing was there. There was nothing there. We obviously heard something. It could have been a pipe. But the Denver Spider-Man tells the story of something that happened in the 1940s, and just the extent that one drifter went following a kind man who pretty much offered his help to help this man is next level. It's the thing of nightmares. It's the sort of thing that you have maybe seen a YouTube video of a surveillance video, and you're thinking to yourself, this isn't real, but it is real. It really happened. And it is by far still one of the creepiest cases on the Murder Monday podcast. So if you haven't heard this before, I'm going to reshare this. It's called The Denver Spider-Man.
When you go on Google Street View and type in 3335 West Moncrief Place in Denver, Colorado, it looks like an old-time slice of the American dream. However, the story of this house will give you nightmares. This single-family Cape Cod is nestled between two similar houses in a quiet neighborhood. At one time, Mr. Philip Peters and his wife lived in this home, and in 1941 was newly retired after working for the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad for 30 years. But sometime in September, Mrs. Peters fell and broke her hip, resulting in her being sent to the hospital. Mr. Peters was away from his bride of 30-plus years for the first time in a long time. So neighbors opened their homes to him in the evening so he can enjoy a hot, home-cooked meal. During these meals, Mr. Peters would complain to his neighbors about a smell in the house and about hearing strange noises that seemed to be coming from the walls. Then he and the neighbors would laugh, because this was the first time in his entire marriage that he was left home alone. But then on October 17th, 1941, while Mrs. Peters was still in the hospital, she got devastating news. Her husband had been murdered. 73-year-old Philip Peters was discovered bludgeoned to death. Neighbors had grown concerned after not seeing him, so one went to knock on the door. There was no response. All the windows and doors were locked from inside when the police finally arrived, making for one bizarre twist. Inside, they found the 73-year-old man beaten with a heavy metal stove shaker, which is the heavy metal handle used to open and close a wood-burning stove. Near the murder weapon, a towel, which had been used to try to clean off the stove shaker. Nothing missing, no footprints, or broken glass. It just didn't make sense. Philip Peters was a retiree with zero enemies. The widowed Mrs. Peters felt well enough a few weeks later to move back into the house. But she couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was watching her. So Mrs. Peters brought in a housekeeper to help with the day-to-day chores, but the house never felt safe. Neighbors, including the maid, claimed that they saw the ghost of Mr. Peters roaming the halls of the home at night. Mrs. Peters was so spooked at the house, she allegedly started calling police. She called so many times that they wrote her off as a kook. And after realizing that the spooky noises weren't going to stop, her housekeeper finally quit. Mrs. Peters felt an evil in the house and feared the worst. So she ended up moving to western Colorado to live with her son. The house stood vacant, but there was a strange smell coming from the house, and strange noises. Neighbors would complain, police would investigate, and there was never, ever anything there. But someone did kill Mr. Philip Peters. Was it the house or something worse? Find out next on Murder Monday. It's October 1941 in Denver, Colorado. An elderly man who had worked for the railroad company for 30 years had retired and was found beaten to death in his small brick home. Neighbors had invited him over for dinner since his wife was in the hospital. He never arrived. They went to his home, knocked on the door, but only after peering through the first floor windows did they find his bloodied, bludgeoned body. His head was smashed with a heavy stove shaker. Nothing had been taken from the home, so robbery was unlikely. He had no enemies, making revenge an unlikely motive as well. Police were able to find fingerprints at the scene of the crime, but none of them yielded any leads. It was evident that Mr. Peters had struggled during the assault, and police said he did fight back using several walking canes, but that the beating was brutal and without mercy, as blood had even splattered onto the ceiling and was spread in different rooms throughout the house. By 1942, Mrs. Peters had moved back into the house. Mrs. Peters actually hired a few women to help around the house. One of those women died soon afterwards. Then, in July of 1942, a woman called police. She told officers that she had been staying in the house and that she heard strange noises. She thinks that she saw something. This woman reported hearing a sort of tapping. She said,
"I'd heard it before, but I thought it was only some woodpeckers. But this time I walked into the kitchen, and I saw the door to the stairway that leads upstairs slowly open. A foot came out, and then I saw a thin, white hand on the door. I screamed, and it disappeared."
Police responded right away and searched the entire house, but found nothing. The upstairs room looked entirely normal, and the panels, which appeared to go to the attic via the ceiling, had been sealed shut. The housekeeper was terrified and refused to return to the home. 2 detectives were assigned to guard the house until they saw or heard something. There were definitely strange noises and smells coming from the house, which was now abandoned. Days passed, turned into weeks, nothing. So detectives were pulled from their watch. Instead, police would go and randomly check on the place. On Thursday, July 30th, 1942, 2 policemen in the area had stopped to check on the place, and as they searched the first floor, they heard a lock turning and a door upstairs. Detectives checked the room, slowly opened a closet door in the bedroom, and there they saw a pair of legs disappearing upward through a tiny panel into the attic. The policeman lunged, grabbing the legs, pulling them down. That's when they described the strangest looking human they had ever seen. A tall man, just under 6 feet, his body as thin as a weed, dirty hair which hung low over his ears, and skin that was as ugly as the gray sky. The man's name was Theodore Coneys. And for the last year, the 59-year-old man had been living in the attic. 30 years earlier, Theodore Coney had come to Denver as a sick boy with his widowed mother and actually met the Peters when he joined a guitar club in the Denver area. At one point, he'd even been invited to their home. When his mother died, he left Denver and became a drifter, for years riding the railroads from town to town. But in April of 1941, he returned as a homeless person, sleeping in alleys and doorways. But as the weather turned, in September he remembered his old friend, Phil Peters. One day he saw Mr. Peters leave the house, leaving the back door unlocked. So Theodore let himself into the house, raided the fridge for food, and discovered a loose panel leading up to their attic. How big was his home? The space was 27 inches high and 57 inches wide. So he stayed in the house, slipping downstairs when Mr. Peters was away to steal some food. He even cut into the house's wiring system to install an outlet in the attic. And then in October of 1941, he thought that Mr. Peters was out for dinner at the neighbors. So Theodore went downstairs to make himself something to eat. Instead, Mr. Peters entered through the back door and came face to face with Theodore Coney. Coney hit Mr. Peters over the head with a .44 caliber revolver that he had found in the kitchen. Instead of running, he instead decided to grab the stove shaker from the stove and beat him with it. Local newspapers at the time dubbed him the Denver Spider-Man, after a police detective said that a man would have to have been a spider to stay up there so long. It took only 90 minutes. Theodore Coney was tried and convicted and was sentenced to life in jail on Halloween in 1942.
Looking for top-tier talent and more profits for your business? Get real in the greater Rochester, New York region. With a highly skilled workforce and commercial real estate rates 49% lower than the national average, companies with 50 or more employees can make profits of $1 million a year more in Rochester than in other high-tech hubs like Boston, New York, DC, or San Francisco. Contact Greater Rochester Enterprise and get started today at rochesterbiz.com.